Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. And this is the day that I produce videos, basically entitled "Responding to the Critics," and we are examining, reviewing, and responding to the new book by my friend Steve Gregg entitled "Why Not Full Preterism." Last week, I began an examination of Steve's attempt to avoid, and that's really all that you can call it, the argument based upon 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 4 and following. In that text, Paul is writing to the first century church 2,000 years ago. That was when he wrote, being persecuted. Now, my contention is that it was the Jews who were the movers and the shakers, the ones responsible for the persecution. There's no question that they enlisted the base men of the marketplace. I've never denied that at any point of time. The point that I have made, the point that I do make, is that Paul laid the blame for the persecution squarely and exclusively at the feet of the Jews. And so Paul, writing to that church at Thessalonica, says, it is a righteous thing with God to repay, and that word repay gives rise to the concept, the Latin term is lex talionis, to repay in kind. Pardon me. Now notice this. Whoever it was persecuting the church was giving them thalipsis. Paul uses the word thalipsis no less than 4 times in the text. It is a righteous thing with God to repay with tribulation, thalipsis, those who are troubling, thalipsis, you. Now it's critical, ladies and gentlemen, fatal to Steve's objections, absolutely critical to understand Paul was writing to a real church 2,000 years ago that was, when he wrote, being persecuted for their faith in Jesus Christ. And he said to those living, breathing human beings, it is a righteous thing with God to repay, lex talionis, to give in kind what they are giving you. Now, let me ask you a question. I'm not using this terminology flippantly at all. I'm using it in its deepest theological sense. Were the persecutors of the Thessalonians giving the Thessalonians, or were they sending the Thessalonians to hell? I'm not asking in the common slang, were they giving them hell? No. You see, God was going to turn the tables. The persecuted were going to become, or the persecutors, were going to become the persecuted. God was going to give them what they were giving the Thessalonians. Now, here's what that means. This is not talking about sending these persecutors to an eternal hell. It is saying, whatever it was that the persecutors were giving the Thessalonians, God was going to turn the tables, and the persecutors were going to become the persecuted. Once again, Paul is not saying, you need to take comfort in the following fact, ladies and gentlemen and brethren. You need to take comfort in the fact that when the Lord finally comes at the end of time, God's going to send your persecutors to hell. It's not what he's saying at all. And we'll have more to say about that momentarily. Now, to you who are being That is in the present tense. And I'm emphasizing these Greek tenses because it is absolutely critical to see how badly my friend Steve Gregg perverts this text. I know that's a strong word, but I don't know of any other way to describe what is being done to this text by Steve Gregg. Let me emphasize, I've got a great deal of respect for him. He's a super nice guy in person, okay? In our formal public debate some years ago, he was just the epitome of a gentleman. I truly, truly respect that. But nonetheless, what he is doing with 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 is far outside the bounds of proper exegesis. It is an abuse of hermeneutic. So let me go back over what I just laid out because it's so critical. Does Steve Gregg deny that the Thessalonians 2,000 years ago were being persecuted? Not that I'm aware of. Does he deny that the Jews participated in that persecution and were even the movers and the shakers of that persecution? Well, he tries awfully hard to negate that reality. On page 106, he says, the city rulers and citizens were predominantly Gentiles. If they were the same people later persecuting the church when Paul wrote his epistles, then the persecutors were not Jewish and would hardly notice when Jerusalem was destroyed so far away from them. Well, I tell you, that that statement alone is full of so many historical blunders and mischaracterizations that it would take the rest of this video to correct. But let me continue. The Jews did not possess political power in Thessalonica, a Roman colony, as they were in Jerusalem. In pagan cities, they would only have the authority and the incentive to expel Christians from their synagogues. But since the church was mostly Gentiles, there is no reason to imagine that after their initial rejection by the Jews, they even desired to attach themselves to the synagogue. The converts were a great multitude of the devout Greeks, not a few of the leading women. The latter would have been Gentile women, probably the wives of important officials. Thus, the church was comprised, listen to this, the church was comprised of few, if any, Jews. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, it would take a good long while to completely unpack that and to completely dispel it. But Acts chapter 17 completely deflates and falsifies the claim. Thus, so again, the church was comprised of few, if any, Jews, and was primarily populated by Gentile converts, including some well-connected ones. After Paul's departure, the hostile Jews would have had no particular concern what their Gentile neighbors were believing about Jesus or anything else. Now notice, Acts chapter 17 is very clear that it was the unbelieving Jews of the synagogue that stirred up the persecution. Well, so Paul delineates between the believing Jews of the synagogue and the unbelieving, which implicitly demands that there were Jews who were believers. Steve's claim that, there were few, if any, Jews of the synagogue who were persecuting Paul has no merit whatsoever. It's an eisegetic claim that has no merit. Certainly has no probative value for us. And then he says that the Jews would seek to attack Gentile believers, including the wives of powerful men, on the Gentiles' own turf seems highly unlikely. The pagan Gentiles would be far more likely to persecute their countrymen who seem to be embracing loyalty to a king other than Caesar. Now, is it true that pagans were at times up in arms about the message of Paul and Christianity? Well, certainly. In Acts chapter 19, Demetrius the silversmith stirred up the inhabitants of the city at Ephesus because so many people were turning to Christ. So I'm not disputing that. That's not the issue, that there were isolated incidences of pagans persecuting the church. Again, that's not the point. Isolated incidences do not prove systemic persecution. And as many noted scholars have said through the years, Adolf Harnack of the 19th century, early 20th century, said, unless the evidence is completely misleading, all persecution of the early church was at least instigated by the Jews and not the pagans. N.T. Wright, modern scholar, says that essentially, were there exceptions, as I've already noted, yes, but essentially from the very earliest period, beginning with Paul, it was the Jews who persecuted the Christians and instigated persecution of the Christians. The pagans, again with few exceptions, were basically unconcerned with these intramural conflicts between the Jews and the Christians. In fact, in Acts chapter 18 at Corinth, when the Jews brought Paul and the new converts to Christ before Gallio, and this would have been in 51 AD, about the same time that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Gallio, when he understood that this is Jews persecuting Jews over this religious issue, what did he do? He had these Jewish instigators beaten and thrown out of court. Now, that completely nullifies and negates Steve's claim that in these Gentile cities, where Gentiles were being converted, that it would never have been the Jews persecuting them, because after all, the Jews wouldn't care what the Gentiles believed. No, once again, according to Acts chapter 17, there is absolutely no distinction. Now notice, in Acts chapter 17, Paul makes a point of saying, the unbelieving Jews, after telling us of the conversion of many of the leading Greeks and of the leading women, Paul tells us that it was the unbelieving Jews who went to the marketplace and got the unsavory characters there to persecute the church. Paul does not say, these Jews gathered up a bunch of unsavory Jews to persecute this little bitty tiny handful of Jews from the church, new converts. No, after telling us of the large number of Gentile pagan converts, Paul says the unsavory element of the Jews who did not believe from the synagogue stirred up these unsavory fellows to persecute the church. No distinction whatsoever. It is therefore totally improper for Steve to argue, this was a persecution against, there might have been a few, just a tiny little few handful of Jews who were converted, if any. Well, if there weren't any Jews who were converted, then who were these unsavory fellows persecuting? I mean, Steve's making the argument there were basically no Jews converted. And if there were just a tiny little handful of them. And yet, the unbelieving Jews went to all the trouble of going to the marketplace gathering up the unsavory fellows to instigate a persecution of this little bitty tiny handful of Jewish believers. And they made sure that none of the pagan converts were persecuted, because after all, the Jews would not have cared what any of the pagans believed. Do you see how desperate this is, ladies and gentlemen? But let's continue, because that's certainly not all. He says, the Jews did not possess political power in Thessalonica, a Roman colony, as they did in Jerusalem. Well, there's a major fallacy here that Steve just glosses right over. And essentially what he's saying is, and listen, pardon me, many Jews have made a similar argument to this when it comes to the trial of Jesus. And the argument is basically this. Well, you know, the depiction of the trial of Jesus would have been such an egregious violation of Jewish law, even Roman law. And heaven forbid, the Sanhedrin would never have done that. I mean, after all, they were really righteous, holy, law-abiding men. No, folks, that's just the point. These men were willing to violate their own laws. Same thing in Thessalonica. This was a mob. Do you think the mob was overly concerned with the fact that, hey, you know what, folks, we don't have the authority to do this, so we better not persecute any Jews, because and we the Jews don't have any power to persecute anybody, so we better turn this over to Gentiles. Oh, but wait, the Gentiles are persecuting Gentiles, according to Acts chapter 17. But wait a minute. You see, by Steve's reasoning, there had to be legal justification for the citizens of the city to rise up and persecute the church. Where did that authority come from? Oh, no. It had to come from the leader of the city. And the leader of the city is not the one that instigated the persecution, nor is it the leader of the city that justified and authorized the persecution. This was a mob scene. But Steve is arguing, implicitly to be sure, Steve is arguing, well, you see, this persecution couldn't have come from the Jews because they didn't have the authority, the legal authority to persecute anybody. Just like, once again, the Jews argued and argue, well, you know, the story of the trial of Jesus could never have been true, because after all, the Jews had no authority. This overlooks the fact that these men were law breakers. It overlooks the fact that in Acts chapter 17, it is a mob scene. And let's face it, mobs are not exactly overly concerned with the law. Let's see what happened in Portland, Oregon, the last couple of years, as the Black Lives Matter and Antifa rioted, killing people, burning countless businesses. Hey, is any of that against the law? Now, we all know that nobody would break the law in a mob, right? You see how silly the argument is? No, this mob scene was against the law. Didn't matter if the Jews had the authority to do this. They were violating the law. But to continue. Now, Steve changes his tune a little bit on page 107. We cannot rule out the possibility that some Jews may have been among the persecutors of the Christians to whom Paul wrote, but Preston's case depends upon the assumption that most or all of the persecutors were Jewish, and that they would be disastrously impacted, eternally destroyed, by the fall of Jerusalem. I never said that. I never said they would be eternally condemned. Now, might that lie in the background? It might. But as I pointed out at the very beginning of the video, the point here is not eternal punishment. The point here is the persecutors were going to become the persecuted. Then he says, even if the persecutors in Thessalonica were Jewish, there is no reason to believe that they personally experienced any particular local consequences, much less suffering eternal destruction, when Jerusalem was destroyed hundreds of miles away. The desolation of the Jerusalem temple and the Jewish state did not spark a general Jewish Holocaust throughout the Roman Empire. Well, I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, with all due respect, this betrays an ignorance of what happened in the first century. Let's go back to AD 66 as an example. There was unrest, Jewish unrest, throughout the entire Roman Empire. As far away as Alexandria in Egypt. Now that's hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. Well, guess what? As I mentioned, there was tremendous unrest in the Roman Empire because of Jewish instigation of violence everywhere. Steve's implied argument is that, you know what, the Jewish war was strictly in Judea. The folks in cities hundreds of miles away were not concerned with those rabble-rousing Jews in Judah and Jerusalem. Had no impact on their lives. Well, again, let's go to Alexandria in Egypt. In AD 66, the Jews of the city stirred up a rebellion against the Romans. The inhabitants of Alexandria rose up against them, and, you know, it all had to do with having access to their synagogues and their places of worship that the Gentiles blocked off, and they revolted and started rioting and what have you. Yeah, the Jews started rioting. Now, by the way, this is not Jewish persecution of the Christians. There might have been some of that involved. No, I haven't been able to nail that down, but the chief fact of it is this is a Jewish rebellion. This is a Jewish riot. And keeping in mind that Steve tells us nobody in the far-flung cities of the Roman Empire was concerned with Jewish issues. That, ladies and gentlemen, is absolutely historically false. So anyway, the Jews in Alexandria rise up and revolt against what was happening against them. The citizens of Alexandria rose up in counter-revolt, and listen to me, catch the power of this. This was in AD 66. 50,000, let me say that again. You got to catch the power of this. 50,000 Jews were killed in one day in Alexandria, Egypt. Hundreds of miles away. And this is at the beginning of the Jewish war. About that time. So Steve's implied argument that the events in Judah and Jerusalem were totally insignificant, of no concern whatsoever to the pagans in far-flung cities, is absolutely historically inaccurate. It's really way, way, way out there. Now, I've got to hurry. Okay. Steve says on page 108, when Jerusalem fell, it ended historic Judaism. But Christianity continued to flourish, underscoring the fact that it was not a part of Judaism and was itself an illegal novel faith system. This led to further more severe persecutions of the Christians throughout the empire, including Thessalonians. If Paul intended to give them a hope that the fall of Jerusalem would bring the Christians long-term relief from persecution, he certainly misled them on this point. Well, this is troubling. Number one, he brings an anachronistic situation into the argument. Well, we are being told the destruction of Jerusalem ended historic Judaism, and that brought Christianity to the forefront. And then the Romans began persecuting the Christians in far, far worse persecutions. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is presumptive. It is historically inaccurate. In 64 to 68 AD, Nero instigated a massive major persecution in the city of Rome. Everyone acknowledges that. Well, guess what? That's 13 years after Thessalonians was written. Totally irrelevant. That was the Neronian persecution. Now, upon what basis does Steve claim, oh, well, that was much, much worse? No, we have record of Jewish persecution of Christians throughout the Roman Empire before that event. Well, you will notice, obviously, I have a different shirt on from the earlier part of this video. What happened was I was just filming right along, and I looked down, and all of a sudden the filming had stopped and then restarted, but it didn't keep what it had restarted. So what I've done is I've kind of cut it off there where I was making the point that Steve wants us to believe that the Roman persecution was far greater than the Jewish persecution. Well, Roman persecution of the church did not become anywhere systemic until the time of Decius and Diocletian, far, far, far beyond the days of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Those persecutions are therefore totally outside the context. There were only isolated incidences, occasions, in which Roman authorities persecuted the Christians, prior to Nero in 64 AD, and even those instances, as we have demonstrated, were instigated by the Jews. And by the way, it's believed by historians that even the Neronian persecution was instigated by the Jews. So lying behind even the Roman persecution, the Neronian, and up to that point there was no widespread Roman persecution of the church at all. So even in the singular Roman persecution of the first century that we really know about for sure, even it was instigated by the Jews. So here's what we have seen in this video. See if I can recapitulate just a little bit. Point number one, Steve tries to deny that it was the Jews who persecuted the church at Thessalonica. He does that by pointing out, well, Paul, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, talks about the Judeans persecuting the church in Judea, but now he says the Thessalonians were being persecuted by, quote, their countrymen, as if the Jews in Thessalonica were not the countrymen of the Thessalonian brethren. You see, that's a non sequitur. There were Jews who had a synagogue in Thessalonica. They lived there. Therefore, they were the fellow countrymen of the Thessalonians. Secondly, Steve argues in an amazing bit of confusing rhetoric insofar as I am concerned. Again, no disrespect, but I just have to point out the confusion in what he said. He said there were few, if any, Jews in the church at Thessalonica. Now remember, Paul went to the synagogue, Acts chapter 17, and preached there in the synagogue of the Jews. Now, does Paul tell us, or does Luke tell us rather, that there was a large number of Jews converted? No. His point is to demonstrate that a large number of the Greeks, even a large number of the leading women, were converted, but he does not say there were few, if any, Jews that were converted. He contrasts the unbelieving Jews who were the instigators of the persecution. And then he says, those Jewish persecutors, if there were such, would have had no interest whatsoever in persecuting the church. Well, we pointed out in the text of Acts chapter 17, there is absolutely no delineation between different groups being persecuted. Luke says not one single word about whether or not it was that these unbelieving Jews were saying, now look, we're only going to persecute Jewish Christians. We don't want to persecute those Gentile Christians. We don't really care what they believe. No, those unbelieving Jews stirred up the multitudes to persecute the church. Was the church constituted of Jews, of Greeks, and leading women? Well, Paul said the unbelieving Jews persecuted the church. There is no delineation. And then Steve says that the Jews would not have cared about the beliefs of those Gentile believers. Well, since there were no Jews who were converted, per Steve, or if there were any, there were just a tiny few of them, why would the Jews, the unbelieving Jews, go to all that trouble, cause such an uproar in the city, persecuting just a tiny handful of their fellow brethren, their fellow Jews? Why would they do that? Did they not feel sufficiently threatened by the number of Jewish converts that they felt they had to stamp this out? Once again, Steve is making some really powerful eisegetic assumptions here that the text simply does not make. The text never delineates between the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers. It was the church being persecuted. So Steve's attempt to negate, to mitigate, and to deny that there were Jewish believers in the church at Thessalonica completely fails. He really has to deny the generic reality that it was the church generically and inclusively considered that the unbelieving Jews persecuted. But then, as we shall see next week, Steve makes some absolutely astounding claims about 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. And I mean, they really are astounding. They are not exegetical, they're not logical, they're not true. So you don't want to miss that. In the meantime, listen, I wrote a book entitled In Flaming Fire. It is an exegetical, hermeneutical examination of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. In this book, I respond. Now, I wrote this long before my debate with Gregg and long before he wrote his book. But nonetheless, even though I wrote it long before that, in this book, I respond to the key objections that people have made to deny the power and the force of 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Go to the store and order the book In Flaming Fire. Now, unfortunately, I cannot offer free shipping on this. That would put me at a loss even on the cost of the book, okay? I've got the price of the book marked down. It's very inexpensive. So go there and order a copy of the book. Now look, this book has been used as a book of hermeneutic in different places by different groups. When you read this book, you will see how weak, utterly weak, the objections that are offered to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, referring to AD 70, truly are. So, go to my website, order the book, In Flaming Fire. Okay, thank you for joining me on this morning's Morning Musings. I'll see you on Monday.